Hi, scholars. Today we are going to look at Chapter 4 from our African American Studies textbook. It starts on page 38. It's titled Toward Radical Pan-African Pedagogy and Civic Education by Greg Graham. And there's a lot of terms and ideas discussed in this chapter that, unless maybe you've taken a history class on anything to do with African history, or sometimes this would be talked about even in an African American history class as early African history prior to the American side here in the United States. There could be a lot of terms and ideas in this chapter that you might need some extra definitions to understand. So I'm going to walk you through some of those key points and what exactly the author is trying to explain in this chapter, and what are the most important points you should glean from it. So first of all, if we're just looking at the title, right away we see a phrase, Pan-African Pedagogy. And the question is if you've never heard that phrase, what is Pan-African? So in the very beginning of this chapter on page 38, I've kind of underlined quite a lot of points in the first paragraph, but I would start with the very first sentence. This chapter ventures to restate for the contemporary moment the importance of a guiding Pan-African oriented pedagogy and civic education and the struggle for a more just and more human world, one that would serve the interests of the communities of concern to the radical praxis that we have come to know by the label Pan-Africanism. So right there in that first sentence, they're talking about pedagogy, which is how we learn the ideas. It's our teaching training that we as faculty do, pedagogy and pedagogical work. And then they've tied it together with this notion of civic education. So giving back to our communities, our civic responsibilities as citizens, and the goal being a more just and more human world. And they're very particular, the author is very particular in the idea that there should be a interest in terms of the radical praxis that is at the core of the movement. And remember, if we're thinking about some of the earlier chapters we've read in this textbook and maybe some of the supplemental videos, Black studies in and of itself came from a very radical movement, very radical politicized movement. And all of that is also tied into some of these offshoots and other ideas that are all very interrelated, including the Pan-African pedagogy that is discussed here in this chapter. If you go on further down in that paragraph, there's another point that I underlined in terms of how Greg Graham is using the term. So he describes at the very middle towards the end, Pan-Africanism, as I use the term here, represents cognizance of this shared experience as well as a collective orientation toward the effort to bring into being a better future for people of African origin. Always central to it has been the imperative of African nationhood, either limited to the various state formations that were eventually brought into being through anti-colonial struggle, and then it goes on, and it mentions some of the head leaders in terms of a Pan-African movement. And I think what is key to understand in that section is that it's a shared experience, collective orientation, and it encompasses anyone that claims African heritage or African origins. And the goal is for a better future. And so, in terms of additional information about Pan Africanism or Pan African pedagogy, I just took a little bit of notes in terms of it's also the principle or advocacy of the political union of all of the indigenous and diasporic ethnic groups that are descendant of Africa and the inhabitants of Africa. And so there can be controversy in terms of pan-ness within communities and communities of color. You might have heard the term a pan-Asian movement or a pan-Asian American movement in Latino studies. It could be pan-Latinx studies, or more often you might hear the term Latinidad. So it's this notion of coming together despite very distinct and very specific differences amongst the groups. So when we use this big, all-encompassing word or title like African, well, Africa is composed of a lot of different countries. And so different people from different parts of Africa have very distinct cultural practices that are unique to their area or their traditions. Just like when we use the term Asian American, it encompasses such a wide breadth that sometimes it can be a little, I don't want to say like insulting, but like how can you lump all of these different, quote, Asian groups together as if they are one? Like if you're thinking Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and they're all very distinct. But the push or the need for kind of a pan-African or pan-Asian movement is because when you unite groups together, you have more power to affect change. And if you recall from the earlier chapter with the interview with Jeanette Davidson and Danny Glover, and that was just in chapter 2, he talks at the end of that on page 24 that the movement started with the need for Black studies, but by bringing in all of these coalition groups, it became something even bigger, right? And so there's a lot of power in numbers and in strength. And so the author wants to look at this kind of a movement to understand how can we fight back against racism and other forms of deadly results from colonialism. And so there's a very specific example. I mean, he does discuss C.L.R. James's account of the Haitian Revolution and Frantz Fanon's book. It's the Wretched of the Earth. So those are kind of smaller case studies discussed in this chapter to give you an idea of what can happen when unity isn't involved in movements. They die. They don't last very long. And the author also uses it as a way to understand what happened after apartheid ended. Okay? And if you've never heard that word, or you've heard the word and you don't know what it means, I can give you a brief definition here in this lecture, and I can include additional notes on our Canvas page. But basically, it was a policy from 1948 to 1994. So it's very recent. It's in the 20th century. And it occurred in South Africa. And it was a national system of segregation and discrimination on grounds of race. And specifically, it was to maintain white supremacy in South Africa. So there was a group of white South Africans that wanted to maintain power and control with the government, with the economics of the country, with even who was allowed to work certain jobs or go to certain areas. And it was a national policy in the country. And I mean, it's just, if you don't know a lot about it, additional research is highly recommended. And basically, in terms of the fight and struggle to end apartheid, and of course, with the eventual election of Nelson Mandela as the president in 1994, there was still, even after it ended, repercussions of that mentality that remained within the country. And part of it is because an internalization practice happens, in which if you've been told your entire life that you're a second class citizen or you're less than other people higher on, like, say, the class system or the caste system, you maintain some of that ideology. It's hard to um, decolonize yourself from thinking in that way. And what ended up happening, and they talk a lot about it on page 39 of this chapter, is the notion of a xenophobic state and xenophobia. And this is not anything new, because this has occurred in terms of lots of different places, and it actually is even occurring right now here in the United States, when you have people with xenophobic ideologies about immigrants that are coming in and taking away the jobs from hardworking Americans, or when you hold terrible racist prejudices about people from other countries. And xenophobia is basically a dislike and a prejudice against people from other countries. And so what happened, and what's described on the bottom of 39 as you continue on through 43, and some of what is discussed from the Wretched of the Earth with Fanon, is that after apartheid ended, there was this xenophobic trend and violence in South Africa in terms of how African migrants were treated from other parts of the continent, from other countries. And the authors trying to understand why this xenophobia occurs, right? Why, after all this fighting and struggle to have this new, almost decolonial state, then you go back and go back to harmful ideological practices. And let's see. So on page 41, in terms of, again, the need for a Pan-African future, it's discussed in the second paragraph on page 41. The hope of a Pan-African future marked by a commonality of historical experience and struggle, as well as by a shared orientation towards the future, was most certainly shaken in the face of the extreme xenophobic violence that occurred in 2008. And so there you are understanding why a Pan-African future and being able to hold commonalities and historical experience shared across a large group of people is key in terms of creating empathy, social change, social justice, because you can see that regardless of which part of the continent you might be in terms of, say, Africa, that there were similar experiences across the different countries. And so if we come together by understanding that there is commonalities with all the differences between the cultures and traditions, that a powerful movement can occur. And so, I was doing a little bit of additional research in terms of the influence of the Black Power movement in the United States with the Pan-African movement here that is discussed in this chapter. And there is also a notion of Black consciousness. It's the Black consciousness movement that was inspired by the Black Power movement in the US that comes into fruition with this notion and this time period of Pan-African pedagogy and Pan-African movement. So that was kind of interesting. In terms of the rest of the chapter and important things you might want to note is there's a really sad poll done at the bottom of page 41 in which there was a survey that took place in 2010, I believe. And it said almost half of the population surveyed, which is 49%, believed that foreigners should be made to carry identification cards at all times, while 53% held that those who were found to be not contributing to the economy should be deported. And as far as justification for the violence meted out to their fellow Africans in 2008, 64% of Black South Africans polled suggested that migrants were the cause of crime in South Africa. And the notion that they took jobs from South Africans was used as a rationalization by a representative 62% of the population, while the matter of their cultural difference was cited by 60%. And so as I was reading this, and that goes from page 41 to 42 of the chapter, I couldn't help but think of correlations between how we here in the United States can treat migrants as well. And so people coming into the country from other places. And it's just really sad. There's this notion of a degrouping strategy. It was a theory designed by a psychologist, I believe, but their name was Erica Affelbaum. And she had said that one way a majority maintains their power structure is by causing those that aren't in power, the subjugated or minority group, to fight amongst themselves, to degroup amongst themselves. And they're so busy fighting in smaller portions amongst their own communities and their own people that social change and power dynamic changes can occur. And so, when you're reading a little bit about that survey there, I just can't help but think of that degrouping strategy of how, even though freedom was achieved in terms of ending official national recognized apartheid, that the outcome of the country and trying to get the people together was still facing effects from that institutionalized white supremacist racist attitude. And it wasn't easily dismantled just because Nelson Mandela was elected to president. Like there was a lot of work that still needed to be done. And in terms of, as you continue on with this chapter, on page 43, the author, under the section that reads Pedagogy and the Radical Black Tradition, the reason that James and Fanon's work is used, the author explains that their work is one for which freedom and political participation in the post-colonial state is necessarily an edifying experience for the formerly colonized. This vision has roots that extend deep into the wellspring of what we understand to be the Black radical tradition, and particularly in its Pan-Africanist contingent, and their understanding of what nationhood had to mean for people who had been enslaved and colonized. So in terms of the two examples that are used, the author is saying that in post-colonial states in which the colonial yoke, the colonial chains have been disrupted and broken, and now the people are back in charge of their own nations, that in order for that freedom and that radical Black tradition to excel, the people themselves have to participate in the political participation. So it's very important that those within the movement take over and change in terms of the governance and the structure and bring the community together. And it is discussed in those two examples. It does happen for a little bit, but then again, it's difficult to be Black in an anti-Black world. And that's also discussed at the bottom of page 44. And the short periods in which that Black liberation occurs and that Black power, that Black pride. And so I think that the two examples between the works of C.L.R. James and Frantz Fanon are just examples that you can use that reference why a Pan-African pedagogy and civic education is needed. And, you know, you might be grappling with whether you agree or disagree with that notion. And it's very complicated, like I said, in terms of how it's described in the chapter, if you don't have a lot of that historical background information. So I'll try to provide some additional readings to help with that. And I think that, you know, on the section from 45 to 44, from 44 to 45, pedagogy, praxis, and meditation, right at the very end of that paragraph, as it goes up to page 45, it says, anti-colonial scholarship gave due recognition to the problem of transformation, which the transition from colonized subjects to free citizens would require of those who had for so long been denied such standing in Africa and its diaspora. The advent of freedom and statehood would, after all, require sweeping change in their perception of reality and in their manner of engaging with the world. So it's a difficult concept when you suddenly have this freedom that has been so long denied you by the systems of power that have run an entire country and an entire region. And the sweeping change and the change in the perception of reality for the individuals that are involved is just key in terms of how, you know, the movement moves forward to that Black liberation. So I know this video is going kind of long. On page 46, there's a good discussion in the center about the Wretched of the Earth and Fanon's account of the anti-colonial revolution in terms of that book. And then the Haitian example is discussed on page 47. And you can also look up and do some research, you know, with a librarian through the databases at the LMC library to get more information if you want some deeper understandings about these historical slash writings from these authors. And I just want to kind of end with a final note here. On page 49, Paulo Freire is mentioned and the pedagogy of the oppressed, huge within ethnic studies fields and within Chicana and Chicano studies and Latina and Latino studies, and really, you know, all the studies, even, you know, Black studies like we are in this class. And what I want to express here with this quote, let me read it first. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the process of education ideally becomes less about depositing knowledge into open vessels and more about a dialectical process of journeying along and experiencing the various stages of the development and consciousness among the people. Revolutionary pedagogy becomes concerned with facilitating and accommodating such growth. It is the feature that helps to make it genuinely dialectical in character. And what that means is power is shifted. And it's even how we do this class. It's not about you having a blank repository in which information is being filled. It's about your journey and your process in terms of experiencing your development and your consciousness within the field of Black studies. And you have a lot of power, you have a lot of control, and you are also contributing to that dialectical educational experience. So I just want to share that. It's so powerful. And finally, you know, the conclusion is on page 50. And I think that a A great concluding point is at the very end of that paragraph, and I'm going to end with that. What we learn from James and Fanon's efforts are mainly, first, the unavoidable pitfalls of a failure to develop institutional mechanisms that might facilitate the growth and perseverance of generally decolonial political dispositions, and second, chiefly from Fanon, that the guiding pedagogy of such an educational framework in cases where it is allowed to develop and take root has to be organic in nature. It must progress, that is, in step with the collective consciousness of the body politic in all its rich and variegated plurality. And so the key point that is being expressed in some of the unavoidable or failed efforts is that institutional mechanisms have to be put in place to help facilitate the growth and perseverance when a decolonial political movement or political disposition is coming into play. So suddenly saying, oh, apartheid has ended, congratulations, here's the country, it's a lot more complicated than that. And having those structures developed institutionally that are decolonial will help with some of the mindsets that try to counter the changes and the powerful movements that are occurring. So if you have any questions about this chapter, reach out to me via email.